Hello, my name is Marco Permanto, and I'm a video game developer. My parents always used to tell me, you can't make a living playing video games, but look at me now. Actually, they never said anything like that, but maybe they should have. Because instead of enjoying games, I can't help but compare my efforts to others and having crippling feelings of inadequacy. And I spend on average 12 hours a day either working on games or thinking about working on games, to the detriment of my health and my social life. Get out while you still can. So I work at Neat Corporation, which is a studio located in Stockholm, Sweden. In June of 2018, we released our first game, a VR title called Budget Cuts, featuring stealth, knives, and robots. After a game releases, many developers write so-called post-mortems, detailing certain aspects of the development process of said game, usually sectioned into successes and failures. In this variant of a post-mortem, we're going to travel back in time. We go back in Git commit history, looking at snapshots of what the game was like at that point. So welcome to the first episode of Budget Cuts, a Git commit history. Let's start with some background. The project has its humble beginnings in July of 2015. NeatCorp had managed to score one of the early HTC Vive dev kits at the Game Developers Conference held earlier in that year. Back then, NeatCorp consisted of just Jenny Nordenborg and Freya Holmér, whereas I worked for another company at the time. But when I heard they were getting a Vive, I begged to be part of the early tests and such, which they agreed to. So the project was started by us three, with me working on it in my spare time, until I also joined NeatCorp full-time. So here's a list of the first few days of commits, with perfectly descriptive commit messages, as you can see. I'll show this view every time we jump forward in commits. I figured we could start at the first point in time where we had functioning content, 2 days after the birth of the project in 20th of July 2015. Budget Cuts was developed using the Unity game engine. When we started out, there were close to no VR-related features in Unity. It was all driven using Valve's Steam VR plugin. At this point though, VR didn't work properly. The only working part is this test scene with a gun shooting on mouse click towards the camera for particle effect and audio testing purposes. Guns in Budget Cuts, I hear you wonder? Well, the way we game designed Budget Cuts is we mostly did whatever seemed fun for a while, and once we had something unique or interesting, we would focus on that. And having no particular ideas at this point, we fall back to guns like any average game developer. Imagination takes effort. Who has time for that when doing anything in room scale VR felt awesome? A silly detail is that the project was called Survive Al at this point in time, which you can see in the title bar. We were thinking of making something related to surviving, and VR puns were all the rage. The model for the gun shows an early design sensibility we ended up sticking to, that the handle for the tool, a gun in this case, should look the same as it feels in your hand. The handle is modeled after the flimsy, homemade feeling wand controllers of the old HTC Vive dev kits, that felt like cheap plastic toys, but with state-of-the-art electronics inside. They hilariously broke constantly, meaning we ended up having a pile of them, all with different minor defects. So let's make a jump forward, not too many commits, but more than a week in time later. You see, we weren't necessarily making a commercial game at this point, where all of us would be working on this full time. At this point it was still just fun goofing around, testing things out to see if we found something worthwhile. And like I mentioned earlier, I worked at another company at this point, and Jenny and Freya were also busy with like contract work and figuring out what to do about their other projects. The silly project name was dropped and replaced simply with Vive. Incidentally, that's what the project is called to this day. Sorry Oculus, we still love you. We have tracked controllers now with guns you can fire in VR. We also have sound, and you'll be able to hear a cute unedited reaction from yours truly when I recorded this footage. This actually feels surprisingly good. I wanted the particles to feel really meaty and fun. Perhaps I went a bit overboard with the barrel smoke, but drawing with it is kind of fun. The particle effects for when the supervisors fire their guns in the final game are based on these, with the same features like the puff of smoke followed by a slow barrel smoke. So these are the oldest assets still in the final game, just tweaked a bunch. Prior to this project, we had made a couple of tests in VR and had come to the conclusion that motion sickness is an issue we want to take seriously. Therefore, the idea at this point was to make a game where you stand still, shooting at stuff. A wave shooter, basically. We are still at 4th of August. I'm making jumps to when something arguably worth showing happens. So sometimes it's a week away, sometimes it's still the same day as previously. Now we have something resembling an actual level for testing enemies coming from around corners and behind pillars. I also stumbled upon the textures used for the particle effects that I mentioned, and I can see that a couple of these are even untouched in the final game, which is funny since I literally threw them together in a matter of minutes to have something to work with. I distinctly remember how amazing it felt to see this level in VR for the first time, even with its basic geometry and lighting. Remember that VR was new and cool, so doing anything felt cool. For some reason, I got a similar reaction now when recording this. Nostalgia kicking in, I guess. Oh look, broken smoke particle shaders. Same day again, a couple of hours later. We tested some more dramatic lighting. The particles look almost nice now. Relatively speaking, of course. Oh no, enemies! With perfectly functioning death animations, as you can see. The model is from a free asset store asset, again, just to get stuff running. No idea if it's still available. You could almost call this a game now. I'm guessing the idea was that you die if they reach you. Apparently not implemented at this point. Now we've reached the next day. I noticed a lot of the commits up to this point are about getting lighting working on particles, a feature Unity didn't have out of the box at this time. It even took extra effort to make it work in the scene view, work that eventually got discarded when Unity added official support. But yeah, our particles were lit before it was cool. A bit typical they're broken in this commit, of course. What this commit is actually about though, is you can now run out of ammo, and guns having magazines. When a magazine runs out of ammo, it drops out of the gun. I remember being particularly proud that they were physically simulated like this, so they could slowly slide out if you tilted your gun. We added a scope to the gun, again, because it was fun to do. So because VR has a convincing quality to it just out of the box, it felt natural to try to make our content equally believable. For example, with the scope here, we have a shader which only renders what can be seen through the scope if you have a fairly correct angle from your eye, inspired by how real scopes work. If you view it from the side, you can only see the inside walls of the scope, whereas aimed straight ahead, it shows what's on the other side. This type of thing is something you'd probably not do in a non-VR game, because it would either be annoying since it's hard to control the angle, or the game handles the angle to such a degree that you don't even notice the effects, making it useless. In VR though, it feels so natural that you don't question it, almost something you take for granted. We also hilariously broke the angle of the muzzle transform when updating the gun models, making the bullets come out of the magazine instead. About a day later, we have the beginnings of a tool selection system and an inventory, which we called a tool belt. Instead of being attached to the controllers like in the final game, it was near your waist like this. You open the tool belt and either select a tool or an item, attaching that to your controller. The idea for how the inventory and tool selection is supposed to work here is surprisingly similar in the final game, just infinitely more polished and iterated on. Still the same day, again in the category fun but unused stuff, we now have ping pong balls and paddles. They felt surprisingly convincing and fun to play with. More on these later. We also have something a bit more iconic, let's say, the first iteration of the Translocator. Well underway with the art in particular, as you can see. We even have animations on the Translocator beacon. Two things led to the making of the Translocator. First of all, even at this point in time, the selection of VR games available and in production was getting saturated by wave shooters, so being yet another one of those just felt wrong. We were also getting increasingly bored with the concept. Secondly, we were starting to miss being able to move around in our level geometry. Having level designer backgrounds, it felt wrong not to be able to move around in the environment. At the time, teleportation type locomotion in VR was done by pointing at the ground where you'd want to go, and at the press of a button you were at your new location. Our use of a projectile with speed and gravity solves both not being able to instantly go somewhere, as well as the distance you can travel in one go. Like I already mentioned, we wanted to avoid motion sickness very early on, so a traditional sliding type of FPS movement wasn't an option. Once we had this in, imagination really started racing. We even had the odd feature of being able to teleport to walls like this. Now, this is very cool of course, but it demands pointing out that this is in fact motion sickness inducing, which was a surprise to us. So, while we kept it for a while, we ended up not using it in the end. We even modified the direction of gravity when teleporting to walls and ceilings, which was fun and confusing. We've arrived at what is more like a polish update than features, but it felt interesting enough to stop by for this. We now have anti-gravity ping pong balls, which are even more fun to play with. I feel like these need revisiting somehow, someday. We also have the first iteration of the new look for what we call the tracking ring, so the player can keep track of where the center of their play space is. The reason it stretches upward instead of just being flat on the floor is so that you can spot it easily even when you're facing forward. More on this later. We've arrived at the final commit for this video, and it's a milestone to say the least. We have the first iteration of a working portal on our Translocator. There was still no particular plan for what the game should be. We just felt like it was strange you didn't know where you'd end up when using the Translocator, when you jump big distances like this. It felt quite disorienting, which the portal solved very convincingly. Hi there, you. I mean me, I think. It's very crude, but actually works much like the final version. We create a camera at the target location where the player's head would end up and render the world again to a render texture, which is then displayed by the shader on the portal sphere. The final portal in the finished game doesn't use a render texture, but at this point SteamVR itself used a render texture, and it was very easy to hijack the rendering code to support our needs. We also have some more level geometry, as you can see, to try out what it's like jumping around in a bigger level. For some reason, getting up to and standing on top of the radar tower, or whatever it's supposed to be, is what convinced me back in the day that this game could indeed be something cool. as if the translocator with the portal wasn't unique enough. I'm guessing my fear of heights was a bigger emotional experience. Okay, I think that's a good place to stop, a big-ish milestone like that. In future videos, I've actually planned to show some implementation details for specific features, showing some code and such. The portal is a good candidate, for example. But yeah, do let me know what you thought of the video, if there's anything I can improve. Was the level of detail good or too in-depth, for example? I don't have a particular plan for when the next video will be out, but I will probably talk about progress on Twitter. Links in the description. In either case, tune in next time for creepy teddy bears and throwing knives.